The air crackled with forced cheer. 20 years since these faces last crowded hallways crammed for exams. Now, under the shimmering chandeliers of the grand ballroom, they were adults. Wrinkles and laughter lines couldn't mask the lingering echoes of teenage angst. The reunion committee spared no expense. Ice sculptures, a live band playing 80s hits, enough finger food to feed a small nation. Sarah, ever the organizer, fluttered between groups, her smile as bright and brittle as the champagne flutes clinking in the background. John, the former class clown, now sported a respectable suit and a receding hairline to match his receding sense of humor. Mark, nursing a scotch, eyes scanning the room with a mixture of boredom and apprehension. The yearbook lay open on a table, a time capsule disgorging memories. Faces, frozen in time, stared back at them, a gallery of youthful optimism and awkward haircuts. Sarah, ever the sentimental one, insisted they sign each other's copies. A chorus of remember whens and whatever happened to's filled the air. Mark, lost in his own memories, barely registered the conversation. His gaze drifted across the page, snagged on a group photo. "Who is that?" Mark's voice, sharp with disbelief, cut through the nostalgic haze. The others leaned in, their own smiles fading as they followed his gaze. Silence descended upon the group, broken only by the distant strains of "Don't Stop Believin'." Each face they passed held a familiar echo of their past selves, yet none of them could place the interloper in their midst. Whispers, hushed and urgent, rippled through the group. "Was he in our class? Why don't I remember them?" The stranger in the photo stared back at them, a silent sentinel guarding a secret none of them could recall. The stranger occupied the center of their group photo, positioned casually as if they belonged. Their smile was a disquieting blend of amusement and malice. Mark traced the outline of the stranger's face with his fingertip. "I don't understand," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper above the din of the reunion. John, his jovial facade cracking, snatched the yearbook, his eyes scanning the faces around the stranger. "This is messed up," he breathed, his usual boisterousness replaced by a nervous tremor. Sarah, her composure finally shaken, plucked the yearbook from John's grasp, her eyes wide with a mixture of fascination and fear. The ballroom, once a haven of nostalgia, now felt suffocating. The air, thick with the scent of forgotten dreams and too much perfume, pressed down on them. Mark watched as Sarah, her face pale, retreated to a quiet corner, clutching the yearbook as if it were a lifeline. John, his usual bravado evaporated, paced the perimeter of the dance floor, his gaze darting nervously around the room. Memories, once safely tucked away, now threatened to spill out, unleashed by the stranger's intrusive presence. Ghosts of their past, long thought banished, stirred in the shadows. Mark, his hand trembling slightly, raised his glass to his lips, the scotch burning a familiar trail down his throat. "It's a joke, right?" John's voice was a strained whisper, his usual humor replaced by a desperate plea for reassurance. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his face pale beneath the artificial tan. "Someone messing with us?" Sarah shook her head, her gaze fixed on the photo. Who would do that, and why? Mark, his mind racing, considered the possibilities. Had they simply forgotten a classmate? Impossible. Their group was small, tightly knit. They knew each other's families, their secrets, their dreams. "Maybe it's a printing error," Sarah offered, her voice thin, unconvinced. Mark shook his head. "Look at the details, it's too precise to be a mistake." Mark ignored John's attempt at levity. A game of cat and mouse had begun, the rules unwritten but clear. They were the prey, their past the hunting ground. And the stranger in the photo, the hunter. "We need to find out who this is," Mark said, his voice low, determined. Sarah, her initial fear giving way to a steely resolve, nodded in agreement. The reunion, once a celebration of shared history, had morphed into a hunt for a truth they couldn't remember. Sarah felt a chill despite the ballroom's warmth. The yearbook photo, tucked in her purse, felt like a brand. She snuck glances at the other guests, their faces morphing into grotesque masks in the flickering candlelight. Was it her imagination, or did a shadow fall over their smiles when she met their eyes? This was supposed to be her night, her chance to recapture the camaraderie of their youth. Now, the stranger in the photo had poisoned the well of their shared history. She needed air, needed to escape the suffocating scrutiny of the ballroom. John, never one for introspection, tried to drown his unease in a sea of bourbon. He raised his glass in a mock toast to the stranger in the photo. "Here's to you, old pal. Thanks for turning our trip down memory lane into a Hitchcock film." He slammed the drink back, the alcohol doing little to quell the unease twisting in his gut. He had to admit the whole thing was creepy, but John preferred logic to paranoia. There had to be a rational explanation. A prank, a printing error, anything but the unsettling truth that their past wasn't what it seemed. But the darkness had a way of seeping into even the brightest of lights. Mark, hunched over the yearbook in a dimly lit corner of the hotel lobby, felt a surge of adrenaline. This wasn't a game anymore, this was a puzzle, and he, the only one who seemed to grasp its significance, was the only one who could solve it. He traced the outline of the stranger's face in the photo, his fingertip lingering on their enigmatic smile. Who were they? What was their connection to him, to Sarah, to John? And why couldn't he remember? He had to know the truth. "We need to go back," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. She stood in the doorway of Mark's hotel room, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed but resolute. John, sprawled on the bed, flipping through the TV channels with a feigned disinterest, groaned. "Back to the reunion? I think I've had my fill of awkward small talk and lukewarm chicken skewers for one night." Mark, who hadn't slept, his mind still racing with unanswered questions, looked up from the yearbook. "Not the reunion," he said, his voice raspy with fatigue. "The source. We need to go back to where it all began." Hours later they stood before the imposing facade of their old high school. The library, their sanctuary during countless study sessions and clandestine meetings, was their destination. The library was a ghost town. Rows of bookshelves stretched into the shadows, their contents holding no answers, only echoes of forgotten lessons and half-remembered stories. They fanned out, each searching for a clue, a yearbook from their graduating year, anything to confirm their suspicions or, better yet, disprove them. But the archives yielded nothing, no record of the stranger, no mention of their name, no trace of their existence. John, his patience wearing thin, slammed a book shut. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "We're chasing ghosts here." Sarah, her initial determination wavering, sank into a nearby chair, her shoulders slumping with defeat. Mark, his gaze fixed on a faded photo on the wall, felt a chill despite the stuffy warmth of the library. The stranger wasn't in their yearbook. The stranger was in every yearbook. Mark's blood ran cold. He traced the outline of the figure in the faculty photo with a trembling finger. Same indeterminate age, same unsettling smile. The background faded into an indistinct blur, but the stranger's eyes held a disturbing clarity. They seemed to bore into Mark, recognizing him, acknowledging a shared history he couldn't recall. "What is it, Mark?" Sarah's voice was tight with apprehension. Mark pointed to the stranger. "He's here. He was always here." The memory, long buried beneath layers of time and denial, surfaced with a sickening clarity. Section 2. The Janitor's Key. The old janitor's office was tucked away at the end of a dusty corridor, its door locked, its paint peeling like shedding skin. Mark remembered the key hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the water fountain, a childish prank that had yielded a treasure trove of mundane supplies and a lingering sense of unease. The key, cold and heavy in Mark's palm, seemed to thrum with a faint energy. He inserted it into the lock, the mechanism turning with a grating click that echoed in the silent hallway. The office was a time capsule. Dusty shelves overflowed with forgotten cleaning supplies and outdated textbooks. A calendar on the wall, frozen on the year of their graduation, seemed to mock the passage of time. The air hung thick with the scent of mildew and something else, something akin to ozone, a faint metallic tang that sent a shiver down Mark's spine. John coughed, his bravado faltering in the face of the room's oppressive atmosphere. "Smells like old regrets and bad decisions in here," he muttered, his gaze darting nervously around the cramped space. "He kept yearbooks," Sarah said, her voice hushed with a mixture of fascination and dread. She stood before a shelf stacked with identical volumes, their spines cracked, their pages yellowed with age. Years of them. Section 3. Yearbooks Past. Each yearbook told the same story. The faces of the students changed, the fashions evolved, but the stranger remained a constant. A silent observer, lurking on the periphery of countless class photos, faculty portraits, sporting events, always present, never acknowledged, as if someone or something had woven him into the very fabric of the school's history. "This is insane," John breathed, his face pale in the dim light filtering through the dusty window. "It's like he's haunting the place." Mark flipped through the yearbooks, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Each image felt like a violation, a stolen moment, a silent testament to their collective amnesia. He stopped at a photo of the school's founding faculty, taken almost a century ago, and there he was, the stranger. His face unlined, his eyes sharp and clear, his smile as unsettling as ever. "He hasn't aged," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling of pages. "Not a day." Mark closed the yearbook, the thud of its cover echoing in the silent office. He had a sinking feeling that this was more than a mystery. This was a nightmare, and they were only just beginning to wake up. Section 4. Whispered History. The old librarian, Mrs. Henderson, widow of their former English teacher, lived in a rambling Victorian house on the outskirts of town. Her memory was fading, they'd heard, but her mind was still sharp, her tongue even sharper. She was their last hope. They found her in the dimly lit living room, nestled in an armchair, a worn copy of Wuthering Heights resting in her lap. Her eyes, despite being clouded with age, still held a spark of recognition as they entered. "The janitor," Sarah began, her voice hesitant, unsure how to broach the subject without sounding like they'd stumbled out of a B-movie. "We were hoping you might remember something about him." Mrs. Henderson chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Everyone remembers the janitor, dear. He was a fixture here, like the gargoyles on the roof, always watching, always listening." "But his name?" Mark pressed. "Did he have a family? Where did he come from?" Mrs. Henderson shook her head, her smile fading. "Some things, dear, are best left buried. Some stories are not meant to be told." Section 5. The Missing Year. They left Mrs. Henderson's house with more questions than answers. The sun was setting, casting long shadows that stretched towards the town like grasping fingers. Mark felt a growing sense of urgency. They were running out of time. Back at the school, under the cover of darkness, they broke into the administrative office. The air inside was stale, heavy with the weight of secrets and lies. They found what they were looking for in a locked filing cabinet, personnel records dating back to the school's founding. They huddled together, their faces illuminated by the beam of a flashlight, their breaths mingling in the tense silence. They flipped through the files, their fingers tracing names and dates, their hearts sinking with each passing year. And then they found it. Or rather, they didn't find it. The year of their graduation was missing, the entire file, gone. Mark felt a cold sweat break out on his skin. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase the past, but why? What were they so afraid of? The silence of the administrative office was shattered by a sudden crash. Mark, Sarah, and John froze, their blood turning to ice. The flashlight beam danced, casting grotesque shadows. "What was that?" Sarah whispered. John fumbled with the lock, trembling. "Someone's here," he hissed. "We need to get out of here." The door swung open, flooding the room with light. A figure stood silhouetted in the doorway. Panic welled up in Mark's chest. "Well, well, well," a voice boomed. "Look what we have here." The figure stepped into the light. It was Mr. Henderson, their old teacher. The face was the same, but something was different. There was a coldness in his gaze, and the smile was all wrong. It was the stranger's smile. "Mr. Henderson?" Sarah stammered, her voice a mixture of disbelief and fear. "What are you doing here?" Mr. Henderson, if that was indeed who he was, chuckled, the sound devoid of humor. "Why, I could ask you the same question," he said, his voice a low purr. "Breaking and entering isn't exactly covered in the alumni handbook, is it?" John, emboldened by a surge of adrenaline, stepped forward, his jaw set in a defiant line. "We were just leaving," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. Mr. Henderson raised an eyebrow, his gaze sweeping over them like a predator sizing up its prey. "Were you now?" he said, his tone laced with amusement. "And what, pray tell, were you hoping to find in those dusty old files?" Mark, his mind racing, stepped in front of John, putting himself between the older man and his friends. "We know about the janitor," he said, his voice low, steady. "We know he's been here in this school for a very long time." Mr. Henderson's smile widened, revealing a flash of teeth that seemed too sharp, too white, too perfect. "Oh, do you now?" he said, his voice soft, dangerous. "And what makes you think I'd know anything about that?" The air crackled with tension. Mark held Mr. Henderson's gaze, refusing to back down. "You're not Mr. Henderson," Mark said, his voice gaining strength with each word. "You're him, aren't you? The janitor." A flicker of something dark crossed Mr. Henderson's face, and then, slowly, Mr. Henderson began to laugh. "Clever boy," Mr. Henderson said, his voice transformed. "But why?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. "Why erase the memories? Why the charade?" "Memories are dangerous things," Mr. Henderson said, his gaze sweeping over them with a mixture of amusement and contempt. "They have a way of resurfacing at the most inconvenient times, and I couldn't have you remembering me, could I? Not until I was ready." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over them like a shroud. "But you, Mark," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "You've always been different, haven't you? You remember more than you let on. You feel the pull, don't you? The allure of this place, the power that courses through its veins." Mark felt a chill run down his spine, not of fear but of recognition. He did remember. Flashes of things glimpsed in the shadows, whispers heard in the dead of night, a feeling of being watched, always watched. "Join me, Mark," Mr. Henderson said, his voice a siren song of temptation. "Together we can unlock the true potential of this place. We can shape the dreams of generations to come. We can be immortal." Mark stared into Mr. Henderson's eyes, into the abyss of his ageless gaze. He saw the power there, the seductive promise of knowledge, of control, of a life beyond the limitations of time and mortality. But he also saw the price, the soul-crushing emptiness, the insatiable hunger, the endless cycle of manipulation and deceit. He took a step back, his jaw set, his gaze hardening with resolve. "No," he said, his voice echoing in the silent office. "I choose my own memories. I choose my own destiny." Rage contorted Mr. Henderson's face. The air crackled. the scent of ozone stinging Mark's nostrils. He didn't need to see the janitor's true form to know it was a heartbeat from breaking free, fueled by decades of suppressed malice. "You don't have a choice," Mr. Henderson snarled, his voice a guttural rasp. He lunged. Mark shoved Sarah and John towards the door. "Run!" They scrambled out of the office, adrenaline propelling them down the darkened hallway. Behind them, the sounds of chaos erupted, a heavy thud, the crash of overturned furniture, a roar of pure, unadulterated rage. John, his face white as chalk, slammed his fist against the fire alarm, the shrill blare echoing through the empty school. Sarah, her eyes wide with terror, fumbled with her phone, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely dial 911. They burst out of the school, the cool night air stinging their lungs. Across the street, a lone patrol car, alerted by the alarm, pulled up to the curb. Safety, for now, but Mark wasn't with them. The investigation was brief, inconclusive. The fire consumed the administrative office, incinerating any evidence. Mr. Henderson was never found. Sarah and John tried to move on, but the past haunted them. Mark's disappearance lingered. The police suspected foul play. Sarah refused to believe he was gone. She saw him in her dreams. He was there, trapped between memory and oblivion. One evening, Sarah returned to the site of the fire. The school stood as a reminder of the price they paid. Amidst the ashes, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. "He made his choice, Sarah. But you still have a choice to make." She turned, but there was no one there. Only the wind, carrying the faint echo of a smile.